Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Give me just 1 second. I'll pull up our slides for today. There we go. All right. Thank you again, everyone, and thank you for your patience as we get all situated. Welcome again to today's webinar. Before we get started, I wanted to encourage you to follow us on social media. On YouTube, subscribe to our channel at Grade Level Reading. On LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, follow us at Campaign for GLR. Please use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to share anything you learn on social media. We encourage you to post any of your thoughts, ideas, or observations, and we will be sure to repost. Welcome again to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce today. Before we get started, I just wanted to give special thank you to our funders, who you can see on this screen here. I want to give special acknowledgement to our enterprise and programmatic funders, as well as our individual donors. Your support not only allows us to hold these vital conversations, but also helps us create meaningful opportunities to share insights, foster connections, and build the GLR community. Thank you. Before we get started, I also want to share a few housekeeping tips with all of you. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to share your name, city, or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select everyone so that we can all see each other's chat messages, and feel free to share any thoughts or insights throughout the duration of the webinar. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box. We will dedicate the last portion of the webinar to respond to those questions, and our panelists will be typing out answers throughout the entirety of the conversation. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to the recording, as well as all slides, bios, and panelist resources, will be sent in a follow-up email to everyone who registered. So all of you here with us today will be getting those resources. And lastly, we will be posting a brief on-screen poll during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And before we jump in, I just wanted to turn your attention to some of our upcoming webinars that we have. Next week on March 10th, we hope you will join us for a very exciting doubleheader featuring parents as essential partners. At 12:30 Eastern Time, we will have a Crucible of Practice salon focused on building public will for literacy by igniting parent and family engagement. The same day at 3 p.m., we will continue the Parents as Partners work, this time with a discussion on beating the odds and reducing chronic absenteeism. So we encourage you to attend one or both of those if you're able. And on March 17th, we hope you'll join us again, this time for a conversation on the teacher pipeline and creating enduring pathways into teaching. We have more sessions to come as well, so we encourage you to check out our Zoom registration page, which will be posted in the chat box now. We encourage you to register and join us. We hope to see you then. And joining you now is Michelle Hyman with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, I'm so glad you're here. So our GLR community continues to explore how literacy development learning happens beyond the classroom, in homes, through media, and across everyday environments where children spend their time. We examine the role of family engagement, technology, and community systems in strengthening early literacy. Today's conversation builds on that work by looking at one specific practical question that we've looked at before and will deepen our understanding during today's session. How thoughtfully designed text on screen, including same language subtitling, might expand children's exposure to print while honoring its accessibility roots, and how that impacts early literacy and learning outcomes. This session is part of our ongoing commitment to surface evidence, invite cross-sector dialogue, and move towards solutions that are both equity-centered and implementation-ready. I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, David Lowenstein, who is the co-founder and CEO of Lionstone Consulting Group. David's bio and the bios of all of our panelists will be linked in the chat. David?
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you to the wonderful colleagues at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for the work they do day in and day out, and all the grade level reading communities across the country who I know are represented as participants in today's webinar. Just to give some framing about our exciting webinar today, this session is intentionally exploratory. It's not prescriptive. Our goal today is to really surface questions evidence and design considerations, as well as practical realities around text on screen, closed captions, same language subtitling. We're not here to advocate for any single policy solution or platform decision or media practice. Also, I think it's important, we all think it's important that same language subtitling sits within a much larger story. What we're discussing today actually intersects accessibility history, literacy research, media design, technology innovation, and policy. And no single lens alone gives us the full picture. So today we're going to begin from an accessibility foundation. And we know that closed captioning in the United States emerged from civil rights advocacy and the leadership of deaf and hard of hearing communities. So we'll better understand today through our panelists' perspectives that the origin of this accessibility foundation helps anchor today's conversation and reminds us that access must continue to remain central as new ideas emerge. We'll also learn that over time, how accessibility innovations have produced broader benefits. Captions and text on screen practices have increasingly supported diverse audiences and families engaged with media in different environments, as well as multilingual learners and emerging readers. And this raises lots of new questions about how and why these benefits occur. At the same time, children's media creators have been intentionally designing with text for decades. From embedded print to highlighted words and interactive experiences, producers have been experimenting with ways to support literacy development, and we want to learn from that real-world practice. Today's conversation is going to move us beyond simple does it work debates. Instead, we'll explore what the strongest evidence suggests, what the limitations are, and how to interpret findings responsibly without overstating claims or dismissing potential value. So our first panel will help us build shared ground. We'll begin with the accessibility history and the research evidence, as well as implementation guardrails, to help us understand what we know, what we don't, and what ethical considerations must guide any future work. Our second panel will shift into design, production, and policy realities. We'll explore how creators and platforms think about text on screen, what intentional implementation might look like in children's media, and what a responsible pilot or next steps could entail. A core guiding question throughout today: how do we move from interesting ideas towards thoughtful, evidence-informed experimentation without assuming that there's a single magic bullet for literacy? And our hope is that by the end of this conversation, we'll all have a clearer shared language, sharper questions, and a better sense of where collaboration across research, media, technology, and policy could realistically move the field forward. So we'll start with our two-part format, and we're going to be inviting chat participation along the way. And to get started with our first panel, which is again focused on accessibility, evidence, and guardrails, I'm very pleased to have Diane Gifford, Brish Gathari, Susan Newman, and Wendy Sapp. Good afternoon, panel.
Good afternoon.
Great to see you all. Well, I'd love to start with a question, as I mentioned in the framing, to Wendy around accessibility. And Wendy, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about how the advocacy from the deaf and hard of hearing communities shaped U.S. captioning policy and what guardrails need to remain non-negotiable.
Course. I'm sure everybody knows what same language subtitling or captioning is, but you may not know that that began all the way back in the 1940s. The very first captioned films came out then. But it really wasn't until the 70s that that moved into television. It wasn't until the 90s that TVs had decoders for captioning. And it wasn't until 1996, not that many years ago, that all TVs actually had decoders or were required to have decoders and captioning for television. Um, how we moved through that was through the deaf community. The deaf community insisted that this was important. This was required for accessibility, for them to be able to access what everybody else has. They were very good at advocacy. They still are. It works when the message is consistent, determined, and relentless. The deaf community went forward with this and said, we must have this. And today we continue to make improvements with captioning through advances with automated captioning, with streaming personalization options. And that is through the work of the disability community and the deaf community to advance these items. The guardrails that we have to keep in place as we move forward and look at some of the new creative options are that we have to continue to prioritize the needs of the deaf because the deaf community are the ones who need this content. It's great as a tool for other people. We can use it at the bar or the gym where it's really loud. We can use it to support reading instruction, but it is absolutely essential for people who are deaf, and we can't allow other uses of same language subtitling to take away from the needs of the people who must have it. Universal design is amazing, but one of the things we do with that is we look at not the needs of the biggest group, but the biggest needs of any group. And so as we move forward, we have to keep that focus on the needs of the people who need those captions the most.
That's really helpful, Wendy. And for those that don't know, Wendy and I first met when I was working at PBS Kids, and before that, I was at the National Urban League. So we became fast friends and kindred spirits because of her work in this accessibility space. And it's really profound what the advocacy accessibility community was able to accomplish through all the way up through the 96 Telecom Act and over the last 30 years. What lessons, Wendy, would you say from the accessibility history should inform how we talk about same language subtitling today?
I think there are really three lessons that I'd like to take from that history and share with you today. The first is back in 1996, when television was required to start having captions, the one thing they didn't require was accuracy. And that became a big issue because there was no standard for how good those captions had to be. And I think as we move forward, we have to require high quality, accurate captions, same language subtitling in whatever way we move forward. I think the second lesson is that we have now decades of research on captions. We know lots of things that work, lots of things that don't work, things that are work specifically for certain populations where there might be cognitive dissonance that comes up with certain types of captions. So I think we have to start with that base of knowledge. Some of that research needs replication or further exploration, and some of these other panelists are going to talk more about that. But we have a very solid existing foundation that we can build on as we move forward. And finally, the third lesson is there was a lot of experimentation with captions in the 40s, and then later with movies, and then in the 70s and early 80s in television. And now we're having a lot of exploration, especially using AI and newer technologies. And we need to be prepared to experiment, to be creative. And as we do that, continue to do that research. If it's not working, we discard it or we adjust it. If it is working, we move forward and make it better.
Thanks for that, Wendy. And one last question for now. What incentives or standards would accelerate adoption?
There are so many things that have to be in place. Like I mentioned before, and with the original push to have captions, it was this great advocacy by the deaf community. As a community, if we decide that this is important for literacy, there has to be a strong, solid advocacy that moves forward. It's not a one shot and done. It has to be consistent. And we have to be talking to all the groups that are involved. There are so many groups. There are the groups that set the broadcast and streaming standards, like the FCC and ATSC or Next Generation Television. We have the content providers, the broadcast companies, the streaming providers, the production companies, and we have to be looking at all of them, not just the top five that might be mandated by the FCC, but we want to get the smaller groups involved as well. And finally, the third group, not finally, but the third group would be the hardware manufacturers and platforms. If the televisions are not being able to receive the content you want to send out, it doesn't do any good. If YouTube and social media aren't supporting easy access to those captions or same language subtitling, it doesn't do any good if it's hidden behind layers and layers and layers that you have to get to. So that's an important piece. And then finally, we need to collaborate with the deaf community. Captions are so important to them. They have strong advocacy around this. Need for literacy is important to the deaf community. And partnering with that group, I think, could be a strong way to help push the adoption of something like this.
Really, really insightful. Thank you so much, Wendy. I want to turn to Susan Newman and Dr. Diane Gifford as well, and ask a little bit about the evidence. Maybe I'll start with you, Susan. If you
Sure.
could share what the strongest current evidence base is around same language subtitling and captioning, and what outcomes should we be most confident in claiming versus not claiming?
Well, I'd say that we shouldn't be confident completely. That I'd love to just share some initial evidence that I think is exciting to consider. Let's uh, the basic premise of much of my work is that very often we think about learning in formal settings, but I've been always interested in incidental learning and learning outside of school. Children are out of school 80% of their time, 20% in formal education. So what I was interested in, and the reason I got interested in captioning, and Wendy brought up some wonderful points, is that I wanted to see it as an opportunity. So let's look at our first study. The first study we actually conducted was with eighth graders. Um, in school, we had a problem. I'm an applied researcher. And the problem was that we had children who were coming in eighth grade from Vietnam, from Laos, from Cambodia, who had never gone to school, who had never experienced school, and were in middle schools and expected to learn science standards. And so we had to find a way of trying to engage them in some way. And what we did is an experiment. We looked at caption television. Wendy was right, and there was some complaints because some of the captioning, Wendy was not absolutely correct. Um, we looked at just regular TV, reading along to help these students with text or just textbook only. And what we found was an intriguing pattern. In each case, whether it is written expression, vocabulary, or word meaning, the children who listened to caption television, who were using captioning, scored better. Now you'll see that our effect sizes are not huge, but it was intriguing evidence. And that gave me an interest in captioning and what we could do with print on screen. So our second study looked at these wonderful preschoolers in Bronx, New York. This is a high poverty community. It's preschool children, 3 and 4 year old children. And we were interested in how children can learn words through media. And particularly, we know that there's some negative understandings of screen media, and that people think that it doesn't have great capability. But we were interested in whether or not we could provide educational short bits to 3 and 4 year old children, and could they learn to words incidentally? We were interested in their attention, their word learning, and what we call orthographic mapping, which was an initial understanding of print. So if you look at this slide, we have our little firefighter. He's watching a little screen media. We're measuring his attention through eye tracking. Next slide. What did we see? Next slide. What we saw was a fascinating opportunity. If you look at this child, if you hit the screen again, just punch that just for a second. Um, if you look at the child on the left-hand side and you could punch the movie, you'd see that the child is looking at the screen so intently. At the same time, on the top of the screen, there is a very complex word, dilemma. Who would think that a 3 and 4 year old child could learn dilemma? And so when we looked at the child's eyes, what we could see is that they're primarily looking at the pictures. You can see it, and they're looking at the characters, which you would expect. But if you look real carefully, there is some eyes on the word dilemma. And that is fascinating to us. This is 3 and 4-year-old children. So we wanted to learn what they were learning. Next slide. And what we began to see is we looked at their children's vocabulary when it was in the context of what they had just seen on video. Then we took the same words and put them in a non-context, in a different context. In this case, the child would have to look and hypothesize. The word was hypothesis, and they would have to guess the word to understand the meaning. Next slide. And then we did something fascinating. We wanted to see, hey, did they know the word, even seeing that word just slightly? And you see in that first left hand, we did exactly what it was on the screen. Dilemma looks exactly what they just saw. But then we did something different, and we took it in a different font, 2 different fonts, and we asked the child, could you identify the word dilemma? Next slide. And what we began to see is a very intriguing pattern, and that is attention was very, very high all through the episode. It did not deviate. And what we then saw, and you can't see this line terribly well, but you'll see child outcomes. These children learn words above chance, um, developed an understanding of those words above chance, and began to identify that word in written form. And so, what that began to tell us, next slide, is that children are learning these words incidentally. We didn't tell them anything about the word, we just showed them the picture. And we were also understanding that children are developing orthographic mapping much earlier than we had ever assumed. These are 3 and 4-year-old children who have not had a great deal of access to print in their environment. Many of them live in book deserts. So we found that captioning may be a very useful strategy, incidental learning strategy, for developing vocabulary and orthographic mapping. And I'll turn it to Diane to continue.
Okay, well, I think Susan said it well, but one of the most promising aspects, of course, of same language subtitles is that it can increase opportunities to see print while hearing in, in the case of the deaf community, perceiving language. So, this alignment between speech and print is foundational to how this reading system develops. I want to talk more about skilled reading and what that looks like. If you could show that slide of Scarborough's reading rope, that would be great. Yes, perfect. So I find it helpful to anchor this discussion in Scarborough's reading rope. This helps demonstrate to me that SLS, most plausibly, it influences the word recognition strand, particularly the phonological and the orthographic processing systems, the letter sound systems, with potential spillover, as we've been seeing from Susan, with vocabulary. So, SLS operates primarily on word recognition, that component at the bottom left. Word recognition is constrained, it's developmental, and it needs to be mastered. So the mechanism behind subtitles is the repeated pairing of spoken and written words, which may strengthen the connection between speech and print. So what evidence finds is that repeated exposure strengthens letter sound knowledge or correspondence. That connects specifically then to auditory words, to their representation in print. This matters because it strengthens the phonological and orthographic processors in the brain, which are the neurological connections that allow for this letter sound correspondence to develop. But we have to be careful because pattern recognition does not automatically assure orthographic mapping fully. Now, I know Susan showed some of that, and that's the beginnings of it, and I think that's very important to think about. But again, true mapping, I think, when it's fully mapped, requires the meaning processor and the context processor to be engaged and active. right? So let's keep going on this thought to what is skilled reading. In this model, skilled reading involves increasingly automatic word recognition. You can see that at the bottom where it says increasingly automatic. And that's what SLS promotes. It's critical to the reading system, right? But if you look at right above that, it says increasingly strategic. So increasingly strategic is a different story because subtitles may reinforce the automaticity side, but strategic comprehension really depends more on knowledge, on language, on reasoning that extends beyond exposure. So breaking it down just a little bit more, fluent word reading then is more attention or more ability to apply attention to print, which then reduces cognitive load, right? So that's a good thing. We want to reduce cognitive load as we become more fluent. But reducing cognitive load then allows for space for comprehension. That allows then for strategy implementation to be, I guess, the reduction of the cognitive load, right? So you have more time to implement strategies and to think about strategies. And this provides access to more advanced, complex knowledge networks, right? So when we think about guardrails, this is important because language comprehension is unconstrained. Language comprehension grows as knowledge grows, and it depends on these continuously expanding knowledge networks. So we can see here vocabulary, so depth of vocabulary knowledge, more and more background information, syntax, which is a big inhibitor of comprehension when sentences become very complex. These discourse structures, text structures, inference, reasoning, all of those things. So what I really want to say is exposure alone does not always build the knowledge networks needed for deep comprehension. But let's bring it back now to word recognition just for a minute. When we think about learners, some of our learners have very fragile decoding, weak decoding systems. And attention is then consumed as they're looking at print. Their attention may be consumed as the brain seeks to make these connections between letters and sounds, for example. That then can increase cognitive load. Thus, these learners with weak decoding systems may need intensive early interventions to support skilled reading. And I think the bottom line here is to realize that subtitles can reinforce connections. They're wonderful, low-hanging fruit. But whether they reduce or increase the load depends on the strength of the decoding system. And then, captioning may not be as beneficial for those who are struggling readers. And there's some, second language acquisition research that does show that intermediate readers actually benefit more, and those readers who have the basic decoding systems, it does benefit them.
Well,
But
that,
yes,
no,
go
thank
ahead.
you. And that actually was getting to my last question for you and Susan. This will be a speed round question. I don't if you can both maybe chime in, but for which learners and settings is same language subtitling most promising? There's multilingual learners, older emerging readers, struggling readers, print limited homes, adults with emerging literacy skills, and where might it be least effective or even misapplied?
Well, I can't answer where it will be misapplied because I don't know quite yet. I do know that Wendy is absolutely correct. We need to have correct captioning. It's really critical because when children make a mistake, they keep that mistake and that becomes instantiated, unfortunately, too early on. But I can tell you who I think really benefits. I really think that we haven't focused enough on dual coding and the importance of children hearing, seeing, and looking at words all at the same time. When they're congruent, when the context and what they're seeing and hearing is all connected, that is a most powerful learning opportunity. So what I'm suggesting is that we really need producers to create great media that bring those things together, the visual, the the auditory and the words carefully constructed. Notice that in that one slide I showed you, there weren't many words, David. There was a key word and it was highlighted in such a way that the children's eyes would go toward it. And I think we need more eye tracking studies to know exactly where those words should be.
Thank you, Susan. Diane, any quick thought to add there?
Quick thoughts, I work with adults, and what we found with adults is that many initially see words as visual wholes rather than sound-based structures. And when they begin to understand this letter sound relationship, everything changes for them. It's like magic. And so I think subtitles can support that growth, but only if this foundational decoding system is in place. And sometimes there are gaps, and gaps stall readers, and explicit systematic instruction is supportive of that. So I think both are needed here. Both are needed.
Thank you. Thank you both. It's been wonderful to learn from you both, Susan, through your many years of service to Ready to Learn,
Thank you.
PBS Kids, and Diane through the Cooney Center and all the great work you do there as well. So thank you both. I want to shift to Brij Kathari, who's been an expert leader on this topic and the focus of a couple of previous grade level reading webinars on some sub-language titling. I jokingly refer to him as our returning champion. But Brij, you were one of the largest you've led one of the largest real world implementations of same language subtitling at national scale in India. Tell us what the experience has taught you about SLS actually, and how it works in everyday media environments, and what assumptions does it challenge?
Okay, well, firstly, thanks to my fellow panelists. They really set it up perfectly for this conversation, both from the academic lens as well as I think the disability rights lens and what's important there. So thank you for that. Now, let me just quickly paint the Indian context, which is kind of slightly different. So we have this big challenge in the country where half the children who go to school and are in school for 5 years, half of them after 5 years cannot read at grade 2 level, basically. This has been consistently found nationally for the last 15 to 20 years. The needle has not moved on that. Now, so it all adds up to about 700 million weak readers in the country, spread across 650,000 villages, so hard to reach, speaking 22 official languages. So literacy has to be, somehow managed in that many languages and 700 dialects. Now, this is kind of like an impossible task if you think about it. And yet they all of them, about 1 billion and more people, watch 3 to 4 hours of entertainment content every day. And they will do that for 70 years. That's the average lifespan. That's an opportunity.
Yeah.
And it kind of brings all this academic conversation together in potentially a national implementation plan. And this is what we started in 1996, actually, as an idea, and started researching on this. And what we found is that it's the only way to get reading as a regular practice into people's homes. Now, imagine what it does especially for girls and women who have fewer opportunities outside of the home, outside of the domestic sphere, and yet they're all watching shows and cinema, etc. Right? So now, this is and what I can tell the whole lot. It's a really 30-year story, but basically, what we found is that a lot of people who are weak readers in the villages instinctively like same language subtitling. I think it's important, the affective part. Why do they like it? They like it because they start seeing it as an opportunity to improve their reading skills.
Mm-hmm.
You and I don't necessarily see that as an opportunity for reading skills because we are already beyond kind of what it'll do for our reading. But for weak readers, and especially even later in life, youth and adults who don't want to be embarrassed to admit that they are weak readers, if the opportunity is to go to some center and improve your reading skills and therefore inform the entire village that you are in need of reading practice or skill improvement, the psychological impact, benefits of having that almost as part of your day-to-day is just phenomenal. Now
Well,
we've
Bridge,
done several, yeah,
oh,
yeah.
just on that, because when Ralph Smith and the team at Grade Level Reading invited me to help put together this and moderate, I was thinking, where's the tension? Because this just seems like, a no-brainer that everybody should embrace it. And so as I was doing a little bit of research, I saw that there were some critiques, and I was surprised. And so because you are a veteran of this, internationally, I would love for you to help address those critiques productively. And particularly, there was some critiques out of the UK with this Nuffield Royal Holloway research. What did they get right, and what are they missing? And how should the field interpret the no magic finding without concluding that there's no value?
Yeah, and in fact, Susan just mentioned that the effect sizes are small. That's exactly what we're finding, that the
Okay.
effect sizes are small, but over time it adds up.
Yes.
So you need to have longitudinal studies. And this is one of the key, I would say, challenges for the study that you're quoting is that it was done over 6 weeks. A month and a half to develop reading skills, it's hard. It's hard to kind of conclude or say anything conclusively. So one of the things that unfortunately the study did is that it concluded based on a very short-term study of very short-term exposure. But interestingly, if you can actually pull up the slide, in fact, from their own study, um, and this is the slide from their own study. So year one is really year one of instruction in reading for children. You can see in the heat map that there's very little attention to the subtitles. Okay, but it's still there, kind of, but very little, which is exactly what we're also finding in our own eye tracking studies. But year two, year three, year four, year five, year six, you start seeing increasing attention to the subtitles. Now, this is their study. Contrast this to the next slide, which is our study, also on eye tracking, except presented slightly differently. Here, what we're finding is that this is government schools in rural Rajasthan, right? So very, low income conditions. And what we're finding is that in grade two, again, the fixations on the subtitle band increase a bit and separated for girls and boys. And as you go up the grades, third, fourth, and fifth, the attention to the subtitle bands also increase, right? So that's basically the fixations on the subtitle band. It's not that dissimilar a finding from what they had. And then we've had done other studies, for example, and you can go back to the screen. That's the last slide I have. Uh, I don't need the slides. So what we did was a longitudinal study of 5 years of same language subtitling exposure on mainstream television. So it's a very naturalistic study. So on a regular program of film songs, right? And that's where we started finding the impacts. And sure, the weakness of that study was that people self-reported whether they watched the program or not. So again, every study will have that challenge. If you want to do a very longitudinal study, you lose a bit of the rigor. And if you want to do rigor, you do short-term studies, right? So those are the kind of challenges that I think the study did not fully address. And I think the conclusion that it does not help was too premature.
That's so helpful. And you've used the word scale. I mean, when we think about what you've done in India, you and your colleagues, it's phenomenal. And so I guess a final question, Bridge, for you on this panel is when you move from controlled studies to real world media ecosystems, what are the types of things that change, and what might researchers and designers miss when thinking about scale?
So the one thing in control studies is that generally the experimenters choose the content that they want to show to the children. The basic model that we have is that you integrate same language subtitles into content that people choose to watch. It's an important shift there because the passion for what they choose to watch is already there. So I think that's why sometimes the control studies miss out on that. The other thing is the control studies miss out on is secondary effects. For example, what we're finding is that when subtitles are there on film songs that are part of every Bollywood film in India, uh, the children and sometimes the families break into a karaoke-like experience. You don't create that in an experimental setting easily. We also find that there are children who are writing down the lyrics of the songs that they like. Again, so the freedom of the natural kind of context is definitely there, and that breaks down in a controlled study. And of course, you the exposure to same language subtitles um, in in leisure time. So a lot of times what happens in experiments is that people still feel they're on guard, they're being watched. But when you're watching it in your home environment, it's less anxious. Nobody's really observing you. So psychologically, it's a much better or a much freer place to practice your reading skills.
That's very helpful, Bridge. Thank you. And a nice segue to our next set of panelists. But I want to thank you, Bridge, and Wendy, Diane, and Susan for your expertise and thought leadership in this space across accessibility, evidence, and guardrails. So I know you'll be continue to be part of our panel and hopefully answer some questions when we get to Q&A from the audience. But I'd love to shift from accessibility, evidence, and guardrails to our next set of panelists, and Bridge is gonna stay on as we talk about design, production, and policy. And so you see on your screen here the five wonderful panelists that we have to talk about these topics. And I'd like to start with Tony Lee from Google. And Tony, how should we talk about auto-generated captions and quality standards? And what's good enough? And what should platforms and the industry think about improvement?
Yeah, it's a great question. The honest answer, in my opinion, is that the technology behind auto-generated captions is not there yet. I know every time that I watch a video and I have the option between captions that are auto-generated versus not, I will always choose the ones that look like a human actually went through and made decisions about what is being said and how it's being said. And I think a big part of that is because auto-generated captions, I think a lot of times people and brands think of it as a fallback or something that will take care of it for them so they don't have to think about it. But the truth is that there's a lot that I think a person needs to decide the same way when it comes to how they choose to write something or present something or craft something. There are a lot of decisions that they need to make in terms of what is the best way that captions come to life that right now auto-generated captions by themselves can't cover. And it made me think of Wendy talking about the history of policy and like how at some point there's a disconnect between the letter of the law being captions are required, but not talking about the quality of those captions or how accurate they are and things like that. And I think a big part of that for me is thinking about who captions are for. So I'm what's called a coda or a child of deaf adults. So my parents were both born deaf, and so I grew up exclusively watching TV as a kid and beyond with captions on, to the point where even the first time I watched TV, like at a friend's house, like in high school or college, and they didn't have captions, I actually found it was jarring, and it was actually harder for me to kind of follow along. Like there's a learning curve, and I think a big part of that in terms of especially this context of like kids media and kids entertainment, like for sure there's value in like captions that when you're thinking about it in the context of like kids as your audience. But I also think there's a big area of like parents and adults in the household. Like I have two young kids and I don't like them watching things where I don't know what is being said, or if I don't understand it, or if I don't know what's going on. And there are decisions to be made about captions and what they imply. So I think a lot about I never got around to seeing it, I'm going to be honest. But like a few years ago, there was a remake Steven Spielberg did of West Side Story, the one that Ariana DeBose, I'm not sure. Did she win an Oscar for? So the whole idea is that there are two factions, right? The Jets and the Sharks. One speaks English, one speaks Spanish. And I remember hearing something about how Steven Spielberg very deliberately said when the movie was in theaters, he did not want to have English subtitles for the parts that were in Spanish. Because if you think about it, that implies a lot. You're assuming that the audience in the movie theater is inherently English speaking, that they're going to sympathize with the one side over the other. And that's like not the whole point of the whole story. So like there are a lot of considerations and implications for like how captions come to life. And so, to be honest, I think the big challenge with video captions, particularly for kids media, is like a human has to think through the right balance of like what is something that like is that will help kids understand it, but also is understandable for the adults in the room too. And so the analogy I like to use is that video captions, I think of them like seatbelts. Like we can say that car companies are required to have them, but if they don't work or they don't fit, or at some point everyone will need the seatbelt, even if you don't all the time. Like you have to think about it in that way. And I think that's one thing that I would love for it to be more widespread in terms of like how brands and platforms in the industry thinks about video captions, like not as an add-on, but as just like in order to make a successful video or piece of media, like it's just something you have to think about from the start.
I love that, Tony. It really underscores that design matters. So another question for you, and I'd love to also toss this to Jess and Ruben, is what are some features of captions, whether it's accuracy, pacing, the reading level match, highlighting keywords, or placement? What features most likely increase learning value?
There are a couple, and I would love to pass it off to Jess and Ruben because I know they've got some really interesting experiences with it too. But one big consideration I think people overlook is the timing of captions. Because unlike a book or an article, closed captions are tied to a video, which means a video is playing. So that's dictating the pace at which you're experiencing something. And there's a disconnect between how fast it takes for someone to read something versus how fast it takes for them to watch something. And so, a few years ago, I was at my in-laws and we put on Paddington 2, great movie. And my father-in-law, English is not his first language, but he's been in the US for over 50 years. But he wanted to put on captions because, let's be honest, the British accent is not always the easiest. But the thing is, when we put it on, even though my father-in-law is perfectly fluent in English, every caption was like a second or two off. It was not syncing up to what you're hearing. So after like 5 minutes, my father was like, I can't do this. And neither could I. Like it's so easy for even like, that's like a simple accuracy, but like you do have to think about like how much text is on screen compared to what's going on. And there's only so much information you can parse at one time. And when you translate it to like what you're reading versus what you're hearing and synthesizing, like that's one reason why I think like as of right now, auto-generated captions is not there yet. But it is like a big consideration, I think, when it comes to like crafting creative and thinking about what works. Like timing is a huge consideration just in terms of like who it's for, how much you're taking in at once. Is it as seamless as possible in terms of an experience?
Yeah, and I'll jump in. I have been doing a lot of work with text on screen, so switching from some passive learning or auto captioning more to we're very intentional about putting text on screen. I've been working on Superwise comic book adventures where we have preschool audiences, and there's a lot of text on screen. And for the series, there was a lot of thought put into developing our rules for text on screen, which were supported by our creative team, our literacy advisors, and also our formative research with kids. And our goals for text on screen with the series are to draw in our preschool audience's attention and to support their early literacy development. So we pay attention to things like the amount of text that we show on screen at any given time, the pacing of how long the text stays on screen, the placement and the positioning of the text on screen, and the ways that we can incorporate other types of visual scaffolding like highlighting or pulsing to support the learning and allow kids to actively engage with the text on screen in a way that feels very clear to them, but is not cognitively overwhelming. And I have a clip to show from the Superwise Shorts that just brings some of this to life a little bit more. So I don't know if someone can share the clip for me. There we go.
So I wrote, make the trees tall. I wanted the trees to be tall, but I wrote the word fall instead of tall. Uh-oh, powerful plummeting pine problems, Wonder Rat. We've got to fix this.
All ball, call, wonderific, you're terrific, tall, hall, wall, wonderific, you're terrific, all. There are lots of words in the all family. The first letter of each word makes it unique. You wanna make trees look all tall, but start with F and you'll make them all fall.
Thank you. So in SuperY, you can see we most often show single CVC consonant vowel consonant words or words within a word family. We also very intentionally focus on scaffolding the learning, so connecting letters to their sounds and then supporting kids in pushing sounds together to read words. And when we do show a full sentence, we also scaffold the learning for kids by highlighting and pointing out each word as we read, and again, ensuring it's on screen long enough for them to process. And we're consistent with the rules, so kids know what to expect and how they're meant to interact or engage with the series during these moments. Often also when we're asking kids to engage with text on screen, we try to minimize other things that might serve as distractions for them. So again, trying to just make sure that they're not cognitively overloaded as they're trying to engage in this learning moment. And I believe that Ruben will speak to this more in a moment using a different series example, but we're also on SuperY developing interactive games and digital storybooks that incorporate text on screen, all the various screens that children are on. And especially with the digital storybooks, we want it to mirror a reading environment as much as possible. So we allow our audiences to choose to have the story read aloud to them or to read it themselves. And we're intentional with the language and the words that we use when we craft the story and write the story, just to help kids be able to process and potentially be able to read the text. And we also incorporate some interactive moments that are meant to support vocabulary development and support comprehension rather than sort of drawing them away from the story itself. Just to ensure that all of the features, including the text on screen, work together to support the learning and engagement. And we find that to be very important. And Ruben, I will pass it to you to talk more about that.
Sure, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm coming at this from more of a games and digital book perspective. But retweet to everything that was said here. A lot of these things are true no matter the media context. So I think there are some slides that are going to be shared to give some visual representation to what I'm talking about. But for those not familiar, I work on a TV show called Alma's Way, which is a series for kids ages 4 to 6 on PBS Kids, created by Sonia Manzano. And in Sonia's vision, the show was meant to empower children by letting them know that they have a mind and that they can use that mind. And in 2024, we created an Alma's Way game to help foster that sort of critical thinking. So the game is called Alma on the Case, as you can see. And in it, we invite children to read graphic novel mysteries alongside Alma and to think through those mysteries as they unfold. So, like if you've ever read a mystery book and you're trying to figure out the mystery as you're going, that's exactly what we're doing here. And we had pieced out actual reading moments for children, but also sort of like a think through moment alongside Alma where they could consider different solutions for the mysteries. And so while we were creating this game, we had this primary learning goal of facilitating that critical thinking that you'd expect for thinking through the mysteries. But something that we discovered during play testing was that children seemed to be building up confidence in reading skills, even if they weren't reading the story word for word. So if you go to the next slide here, I think we cut some videos. Yeah, so this is an example of what the screen looks like as you're reading through our storybooks and sort of the reading sections of the game. And this was created with a lot of child input. We were playtesting at every step of the design process with children ages 4 to 6 in preschool classrooms, both playing by themselves and also playing alongside peers. And we found a few key things that really shaped the design of this game. The first was that we didn't want to prescribe descriptions, we needed to ask for them. So we spoke with children directly to learn how they would describe elements of the game, and then we used those descriptions in text and in voiceover. So in this instance, you can see that Busy Bird has lost one of her bouncy balls. And that text on the top right there says she dropped one of her bouncy balls and now she can't find it. Oh no. And that description and that reaction of oh no actually came from a child during a play test. And that was something that we saw across play tests with other children too, that they reacted to that line, would repeat it out loud after Alma would read it out loud to them, and sometimes even tap on the text box to repeat it again. Um, and that leads into the second piece here, which is that we found that we needed to allow for children to process the text in non-linear ways. So you just heard me say repetition. Every single thing on this page here can be tapped or clicked on to repeat the VO for that thing. So every single text box can be tapped on to hear the text be read out to you. Every single piece of the image can be tapped or clicked on to get a description of it. And you can even tap or click on Alma, and she'll remind you of this during the game, to have the entire page read out to you again, even though when you first land on the page, everything is read out to you. And of course, we also have visual support for that, so like highlighting of the text boxes as they're being read. But we wanted to make sure that a child could kind of drive the reading experience, especially if they are an earlier pre-reader, and allow themselves to direct what was most interesting. And you'll notice there's also a back button on the bottom left there. That was so that children could actually flip backwards in the book. We weren't encouraging them just to, go linearly through the story. If they realized, wait a second, I need to go back, or just I want to go and look at that image again, they could do that. They could flip backwards and actually rehear parts of the story and click around. Um, and another piece there actually was also the ability to rush through the book. We noticed in playtests that a lot of kids just wanted to flip through all the pages and flip through them really as quickly as possible. Smash that button on the bottom right, flip through the pages as much as they could, get to the point where the game was going to stop them, and then figure out what to do from there. And we allowed for that because we saw in playtesting that this was building some level of confidence with these children, and the idea of just like, I can turn these pages and I can make my way through this book. And that sort of confidence building, I loved what Bridge said earlier about the affect piece of it and how it makes a child feel. We were giving them like a sense of joy and confidence in navigating the space by being able to do that. The third piece goes back to what Tony was saying a few minutes ago, is we need to weave a lot of things together here in this game. As you can see, there's the actual text on screen, there's the visual representation of the text, whether it's in a box or a speech bubble, whether it's in black text or if it's in a different color, how it highlights, the actual images that are on screen, the sound effects, the voiceover. There are so many different sensory channels in the game at once. And so we needed to make sure we were carefully weaving all of those together, and being really intentional on what goes to what. And especially because we make this game in both English and Spanish. And so we wanted to be equally intentional for the Spanish version of the game. And what that meant was actively resyncing up the voiceover, actively resyncing up the sound effects, making sure that the way the lines break in the text boxes is consistent, or at the very least gets the same ethos across on what you're trying to say in each of those text boxes, and playtesting, of course, in both English and Spanish. And then the last thing I want to call out was just that it needs to be fun. We learned this really quickly that I don't have it here. I think we cut it for time. But there was a video before it that showed that the way that the game works is you can open these flaps as you move through the pages, and that the flaps have like a sound effect that will play as you open them up, and also like different pieces of the book that you can collect. And we found we needed these both to keep children engaged, but also to allow for children to have a bit of peace and a break from something that may be a little bit extra difficult for them. If a child hasn't been reading before, or that this is kind of like a new way that they're challenging themselves, we found that it was really helpful to have something they could do on the page that was fun and silly and that they could laugh at with their friends before moving on and trying again on the next page.
That's great. Oh, this is awesome, Ruben and Jess. Thank you both, and Tony as well. We'll come back to you, Tony, too. But it's a thrill to be reunited with my public media PBS Kids friends, and And I want to turn to our colleague Jessica Rosenworcel. It's not often we get to talk to a former FCC chair and the current executive director of MIT Media Lab. So you have a really valuable perspective, Jessica. One of the questions we wanted to ask were, do you see shifts happening in how the media ecosystem thinks about accessibility features, from compliance to intentional design?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for including me and my vantage point here, which, like you said, is not just informed by the MIT Media Lab, but by my history of working as the chair of the Federal Communications Commission. Because during my time in public service, I could tell you I saw that those shifts were very real and very present because accessibility was becoming part and parcel with intentional design during my tenure in government. And innovation had a large role in making that happen. Because when I went back and, would study early efforts with captioning, you'd learn about these big, clunky, standalone decoder boxes that needed to get hooked up to televisions. And thanks to things like the Television Decoder Circuitry Act, that equipment was suddenly included in our television boxes and part and parcel with our screens. And then you had the Americans with Disabilities Act, which came in and actually made captioning a requirement. So what you had was the law creating obligations, but it's innovation over time that made it less costly and more present because we moved from always having humans doing all of our captioning to new technologies like automatic speech recognition, which could reduce the cost. And we've also created screens and content that's available for all of us in many more places. So there's just so much more opportunity to make this as a part of intentional design right now, when it used to always be about compliance and the law and cost. And so I think that that transition is one we should celebrate, and it's going to create more opportunities for learning in the road ahead.
That's great. And from your perspective, why should we think about subtitles and captions as important accessibility features, but also as something that may support learning and literacy?
Well, I think if you look at the history of accessible technologies, what you tend to find is that they're actually the bleeding edge of technologies and that more people use for more purposes. If you go back and you look at early TTY, which I think stands for text or telewrite, that's really what SMX texting is that we all use today. And it was chiefly used by people who were deaf for phone calls. And they came up with a substitute that, again, is a lot like the texting we all use right now. If you think about audiobooks, they were developed for the blind. But more than half of the US adult population now listens to audiobooks. I mean, even things like in the physical world, like curb cuts, they were designed pursuant to the Americans with Disabilities Act to make it possible for wheelchairs to move around. And if you've ever been a parent with a stroller or someone with a bulky suitcase with wheels, you've benefited too. And similarly, the same goes for captions. I mean, it was the National Association for the Deaf that was championing them as the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. But now what we are seeing is captions on so many more screens with so many more kinds of content and so many more opportunities to use that technology to support learning and so many broader applications. And so to me, this is part of a long history of how we think about accessible technologies. And then we get to explore all the other opportunities they create. And they're usually even more exciting than what we started with.
I agree. Well, last question, Jessica. What surprised you most during your time at the Federal Communications Commission about how media policy intersects with educational outcomes?
Well, I took over and it was like the late days of COVID. So we were all still working digitally and talking about what education can do. And everyone in any job takes over and thinks that the world is new to them. And everything has never happened before. After all, we were in a global pandemic and it felt like all these ideas should be fresh and different. But when I went back and I looked at that 1966 report that Joan Gans Cooney sent to the Carnegie Corporation, I found it just totally stunning because she made the case for what eventually became Sesame Street by just talking about the mesmerizing power of a screen for a young person and how instead of, pushing back on that, we should say, well, this screen can do more than entertain. It can enrich and it can educate. And we got to explore how to wrestle with this new technology, the television, and do something about it to help preschool learners so that, they have a fair shot, and particularly those who are in low income households. And it's all right there. Everything she understood maps onto the world we have now, even though it feels radically different. I mean, every one of us can watch what we want when we want it on any piece of glass handy. But when you combine her insights with those possibilities of watching in so many more places, we're going to have lots of content that's not good, but we are going to also have an explosion of content that could be educational and beneficial. And it's going to be so much easier to watch. So, what struck me was for all the new ideas I wanted to have about how, the digital world was changing, I saw that there's a lot of precedent to this thinking and a lot of fundamental truths that really came out of her early work.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Jessica. It's a reminder of how special it was to have you as the chair of the FCC, and we're excited to see all the great work that you're doing at the Media Lab. So we really
Oh,
appreciate
thank
you.
you.
Yeah. I want to turn to Bridge and Tony and just ask you both, looking ahead, what would meaningful progress look like, not just in research, but in real world adoption of same language subtitling, text on screen? And what's a realistic near experiment or pilot you think the field could undertake, maybe in the next year?
Should I jump in? Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. So we've moved beyond a pilot in India. The pilots were done way back. And right now, let me just talk about the policy shifts that have happened. All of cinema, films have to carry same language captions and audio description. It's a mandate. So 2,000 films a year in all Indian languages have to have it. Otherwise, they will not be certified. This was passed in 2024. It kicks in finally this March 15th for all films. On streaming platforms, the guidelines are that right now, over the next 3 years, all new content will have to have same language captions. Right? That's in all Indian language. It's interesting that all English content globally has English captions, and yet other languages don't. Why? So even just asking ourselves this question, parity with English, I think it's important. Then on television in 2019, this was passed that half the television entertainment content will have to have same language captions. And it's remained a recommendation. It didn't become a mandate, and therefore it's sort of not yet implemented perfectly, but still 100 TV programs today have captions, and a lot of the battles have been fought in court. In fact, the US experience, National Association for the Deaf, which Jessica mentioned, versus Netflix 2012. Netflix lost that battle for having English captions on English. And today, who's the biggest beneficiary of that? Netflix, of course. So sometimes the corporations also don't understand fully actually what it means if they start even talking about this as both an entertainment tool, but also an educational opportunity for whoever wants to leverage it for language learning, for reading literacy, for, of course, media access. Tony touched upon habits. In Finland, you take away their captions, people will complain. Everybody grew up with them. And this is exactly the shift we would like, at least in India, right? Once children grow up with captions, you take them away, they'll complain. So 70 years, 1 billion people reading that much, how can any country, frankly, remain a weak reading country? It's an opportunity. It's not even, I mean, it's so low hanging, this fruit. And yet, and it was mentioned in the first panel that this is the captions is a 50-year story or more, right? And yet we're talking in 2026 about, is this good for education or not? And should it be a policy? Should it be a default option on children's programming?
That's what I wanted to. I'll give Tony a chance, but Tony, feel free to respond to that first question and or this question about what would it take for major platforms to enable a default on subtitle for children's content, and what has the convening power, or what incentives or standards could accelerate that type of adoption?
Yeah, I can touch on both those. So first of all, Bridge, I'm thrilled that you had that Netflix anecdote because I thought I always like the only one who had that in my back pocket about like how brands can be on like the right side of history. So like amazing. Yes, and it's totally true. And like so I think like what meaningful progress would look like or what it would take. I'm gonna be totally honest, like I'm a pretty snarky person. Like I tend to assume the worst in people. But when I think about like captions and like how to go about it, what I've realized is like if you've never used them or worked on them, like it's hard to know how to do it. You're just like, well, so what do I do? And I do think that like more explicit, clear standards about the bar of quality required for captions would help people a long way. So like even for example, like I personally think like all capital letters in video captions, like as a default, should be banned. It should be illegal because it makes it harder to read, and that affects the timing. And like I know why people, why like I've watched a few YouTube videos from NBC from the Olympics, and I know why their closed captions on YouTube are all caps because they're just exporting it from the live broadcast. So it's not timed, it's not fixed, it's not corrected or anything like that, and it's harder to read. And that's the letter of the law, like currently. Like, and there's room for improvement. Like, I do think like the more you spell out, like, here's what you should do or here's what you're required to do. Like, I do think making it a legal requirement or like being able to impact policy is probably the most direct catalyst for this kind of change. But I think to your second question, David, about like what would it take for major platforms to like want to do this? Like, yes, you can do it, make it a requirement, but I do think there's a case being made about like how much it helps engagement. It's like you spend all this time making this media, like or you want people to experience the thing you've made and funded and thought about in the way you wanted to. Good video captions that meet this bar of quality will help more people experience it the way you want it to, as opposed to just putting out the world and having people be like, I don't get it, or I didn't understand it, or I didn't feel the way you wanted me to feel about it. Like, so I think that, and I'm sure there are like interesting statistics and numbers about like the scale at which like people watch with subtitles or captions. And those numbers exist, but I do think there's a case to be made about like it will help you, the thing that you made and want to put on the world, like it will help more people experience it the way you want it to if you can think about captions in a way that's thoughtful and like meaningful to like your creative intent.
That's great. That's great. Well, last question for Bridge and Tony as well, maybe. But if a platform leader was watching today and asked, "What's the biggest misunderstanding people have about implementing same language subtitling at scale?" What would you say?
In India, this is playing out in real time. In fact, the streaming platforms are still not learning from the experience, probably from the past, that actually captions help everybody. And seeing the value that people see in it takes time for the industry to sometimes understand. And often they're focused on an urban audience because that's where the initial growth was. But the rural audiences are very different in the Indian context, and they actually love and want to leverage that for educational purposes. So platforms often don't understand that. Same thing with the film industry, etc. But the biggest beneficiaries eventually are going to be the same platforms.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, I totally agree. The biggest misunderstanding I would say is that people think that video captions and closed captions are niche, that they only help a certain small group of people. And certainly, if you look at it through the lens of like, well, it's only for people who are deaf, hard of hearing. Yes, that's a certain number. But if you expand it to like, if you, speak a second language, like, or you're living somewhere where the language is not your first language, or you're in a place where you've ever like watch stuff on your phone without audio on, or you have room, like there are so many use cases for why captions like are actually helpful to everyone that I think that's the biggest thing that I would want to impart is that it's not a niche thing. It's like anyone, like I feel like with each new Christopher Nolan film, like the audio gets harder and harder to understand. So it's like if you like movies and you like Christopher Nolan, like great captions are for you, like good video captions help everyone. Would be my
That's
thing.
great. That's great. Well, I want to thank you again to all of our panelists. This is a moment where now we invite you, our audience, into the conversation. So please do drop your questions into the Q&A box, and we'd love to hear what's resonating or what you'd like to explore further. And as we sort through the audience questions, let's see. Maybe we can start with this. What needs to change in the larger system, whether it's funding, policy, or mindsets, for this work, for your work, to reach more families? I'll open it up to both panels. So, what needs to change in the larger system, mindsets, policy, or funding for your work to reach more families? And I'll also share one other question, and then you can choose which one you want to respond to. But there was also, what are your thoughts on the intersection between the negative impact of excessive screen time and caption exposure?
I can speak to the first one just a little bit. Just from the perspective, I'm a producer, and for the producers that are in the audience, we'll have the same answer to that question every single time, which is more time and more money to do it. We started translating all of our games into Spanish because Spanish is the second most spoken language in the United States. And there are a ton of kids that benefits, and we're only able to do that because we were able to get more money to do it and extend the timeline that it takes to create all of our games in order to do that. And so the leeway in order to do that is incredibly important.
Thanks, Ruben. Anyone else? There are other questions.
Wendy, and I'll speak from the perspective of Bridge Multimedia. We recently collaborated with a large group of disability organizations to, write recommendations to send to the FCC on what should be, what standards should be in place around captions, actually. And I think being involved at all stages of that process is a really important piece of this so that everybody is educated and all the voices are heard. Um, and that's a long-term solution. It's not a quick fix, but I think it's something that we have to look at.
I can talk a little bit about negative screen time. I think that
Yeah.
possibly it's important to remember that, we have a screen time and it's important at that moment, but also rich literature, language is also important. So it's all in moderation, I think.
Right. I'll add to that. I deal with young children. 3 to 5 years old is the usual group I hang out with. And I feel very strongly that there should be specific times and limits to screen time. We want our young kids to play and to talk. And one of the things that I always notice when I'm on the subway in New York is I see a mother watching her screen and the child watching his screen, and they are never talking, and they never have any conversation. And we know conversation is so critically important. But at the same time, when we say that screen time should be limited, we want children to enjoy the screens. They love it. We saw their attention repeatedly in our studies, which means that good educational media, good programs like Super Y and some of the programs that you showed today can be a wonderful source of vocabulary and learning. So we have evidence year after year of children learning new words, complex words that we never thought were age appropriate necessarily, learning new words through screen media because of the visual and the ability to see those words on screen. So going back to what some of the others have said, good media can really improve children's skills and can provide them with the motivation and the excitement of learning. And I think it's a tragedy when we just say screen time is bad. What we should say is it needs to be limited, it needs to be good, we need to have good content, and captioning can be a wonderful resource.
And
Oral language, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to tag on to what Susan was saying too about, the benefits of co-viewing too. I'd be interested to see the research of, do the positive benefits of captioning get further improved when a parent is co-viewing and supporting a child's vocabulary development and comprehension of the episode to build stronger connections to that text. So it might be something to look at for future research as well. Sorry, Diane, go ahead.
No, it's all right. I was just kind of going where you were going in the thought that oral language is so important for the basis of reading. And that's where it all starts. And the more language, parent, child, teacher, child, whatever it might be, listening to screen time and being able to these great programs that we just saw examples of allow for language to develop. And that's the beginning of it all. And very important for reading.
Right. So I just want to add a little, we did a study, again, using eye tracking, etc., and we found that co-viewing very often was distracting, actually distracting for children, because what they were doing is they want to see the content and they want to experience that content deliberately. And what was happening is some of that co-viewing was distracting, was taking them away from the content. So I just encourage people to think that children love good media. Let them have good media. Let them experience it and interact with it. And I think it can have an effect that way without necessarily adult mediation. I want parents to feel less guilty. You know, do something else while their kid watch good screens.
That's great. Maybe we have time for a couple of other audience questions. One that came in is, what data would platforms need to collect to meaningfully evaluate impact? And are there privacy considerations to weigh? And I'll give you a second question if that's not the one you want to answer. As we think about improving children's reading skills, how do we address two key concerns? First, the inaccuracy of auto-generated captions, as Tony rightly pointed out, and second, the appropriateness of content being captioned, particularly when some popular media, such as certain Bollywood songs, may contain lyrics that are not suitable for young children.
I can touch on this in a little bit. I think context is everything. So I think when you're thinking about writing video captions for kids, like if there's a Bollywood song playing or something like that, like you have to think about like what is it you want people to take away from it? Is it the fact that it's the vibe that it's setting? Is the fact of like where you are, like where, there are lots of ways to capture something like the music that's playing that doesn't have to be lyrics. I mean, I think that's a good reason why auto-generated captions, like as they are right now, aren't ready to make those decisions for you. They can't decide this is appropriate or this is the right thing to call out. Like, so I think it's about the context of it, and it doesn't have to, and I think those kind of judgment calls, but like this doesn't feel right for the audience that we're talking about, whether it's kids or not. Like, I think those are the right calls to make, and that's kind of what goes into making video captions that work.
This is Wendy. If I could just add on to that, that's some of the advantages that are not available right now, but in the next few years when people will be able to personalize their captions. And that deaf adult can say, I want to hear everything the hearing adult hears. And the parent of a young child can say, I want my child to have these guardrails around what is presented to them. It's going to be really, it's going to open up a lot of new doors for us. We're not there yet, but it's coming.
Yeah. That's great. A lightning round wrap up to this Q&A. And I would like to give all of our panelists 30 to 60 seconds to respond. But if we reconvene this group next year, who should be invited that wasn't invited this year? What would you hope has changed? And how can the audience help?
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
It ties up with the question on data as well for platforms. I think Netflix or other streaming platforms can do this one experiment. It should be an RCT, where in certain areas they do default captions on for children's content and see what that does to reading skills. And in certain areas, don't do that as default on and see what that does to reading skills there. You need a study of that scale to kind of then say, okay, does it work or not? We are actually in the process of doing this in the state of Maharashtra, which is 120 to 130 million people. All the content there in Marathi will be captioned in Marathi. Of course, we don't have the luxury of saying we were not going to do it for some people. And we're just going to follow how the reading skills that have plateaued for a while are going to change at that scale. So experiments and pilots of that scale will determine at some level what's impactful or not. Yeah.
Thank you, Bridget. Anyone else? And Bridget, you have a couple of really great researchers on the panel here that might be interested in doing that RCT with you. So
All right, I'll go. I would like to see more of the customization. I think Wendy mentioned it. We're on the cusp of being able to do very interesting things with customization. I'd love to see more of it in the near future, not far future. And secondly, we often treat accuracy of captions and ubiquity as a trade-off. I think we should demand more of both going forward. I don't want to treat it like it's impossible to have it everywhere and we have to accept poor auto-generated captions. Accuracy and ubiquity should be able to move together.
thank you. Anyone else?
I can speak on what I hope to see in content quality. I know we were just talking about letting children watch good media, and I love that. But also, there's no denying that there are a lot of bad actors out there these days that are making things that are lowest common denominator, that are made to be addictive, and made to keep eyes on them as long as possible. And so, one actionable thing I would hope to see for content creators and for platform designers is just to value off-ramping from like not watching forever, not playing forever, creating things in games and in shows and in videos that are natural stopping points so that kids can engage with the things that they love and then stop.
That's great. Ruben, maybe I think you'll have the last word here for our panels, but Ruben Sudak, Jess DeMontsevier, Brish Gathari, Diane Gifford, Susan Newman, Wendy Sapp, Jessica Rosenworcel. Thank you all so very, very much. Brish Gathari, Tony Lee, we really appreciate you all so much for taking the time and sharing your expertise and commitments with us today. And I will pass it back over to Michelle.
Thanks, David. So as we close, I want to thank you, David, not only for moderating today's panel, but for your thought leadership that you brought in shaping, designing the session. And a sincere thank you to all of our panelists for such a rich and generative discussion. So today underscored something powerful when we bring together leaders across accessibility and literacy research, media design, and policy perspective. We create real opportunities for thoughtful and forward-looking progress in how text on screen and same language subtitling are practical and scalable ways to increase children's exposure to print in everyday environments and can impact learning and literacy outcomes. We're grateful that you joined us today. We hope that you'll join us for some future TGLR webinars, and we look forward to building this momentum in the months ahead. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Be well.